How did UConn become an offensive juggernaut? You're Locked On UConn.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver who likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. So how did UConn become an offensive juggernaut? To answer that question and more, we bring in Michael Cohen, who's a Fox Sports journalist with a strong focus on college sports, most notably football and basketball. Michael joins us today to discuss his latest piece on foxsports.com on how Dan Hurley built UConn into an offensive juggernaut. Michael, welcome to Locked On UConn.
Hey, how's it going, Mark? Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure, man. I messaged you last night because I saw this article surfacing on X and was not familiar with your work. I'd be completely transparent. And then I read the piece and was just blown away. Very well done, very in-depth. And it provides a look at how Dan Hurley, undertook a significant offensive overhaul following consecutive first-round exits in the NCAA tournament. So my first question to you is on this offensive shift. What specific aspects of the offensive strategy did they identify as the most crucial to change and why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing that they wanted was they needed better shooters. They knew that after that New Mexico State game and the Maryland game where they went 7 for 22 or 7 for 23 from three-point range in both games, and they only scored 22 points in the first half of each game, that was a problem. They needed guys who could score. They needed guys who could score efficiently. And when I mean efficiently, I don't just mean like they shoot 50 or 55% from the field. I mean they're scoring from efficient parts of the floor, which in this analytic-driven world means the three-point line. So they wanted better shooters. And to set up those shooters, they wanted better passers. And that means they needed guys who could process the game at a higher level. So they wanted what they called better game processors. So guys that could think more quickly and more intuitively on the floor, so that they could set up these shooters. They could keep the ball moving. There wouldn't be stagnation. There wouldn't be slow tempos. They could move the ball as quickly as they wanted. And then they wanted to embrace the analytics side of it by focusing less on the mid-range jump shots or the pick and roll in isolation, and more on either three-point shots or very high percentage shots in the restricted area around the rim.
So essentially, fans who grew up watching 90s NBA and college hoops who are screaming at their TVs about why are they shooting so many three-pointers should just shut up and realize that there's a reasoning behind it and not just wild, and they're just not wildly chucking up shots, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the analytics side of it really came from Luke Murray, and I know we're going to talk about him a little bit later, so I won't go too deep into it now. But essentially, Luke was the one that drove the analytics and really introduced that side of things to Hurley and Kamani Young. And so what they really focused on was this idea that you want to maximize your points per shot. That was a metric that became very, very important to them. And so what I mean by that is, let's use a very simple example. If you take 5 3-pointers and you make 3 of them, or you take 5 2-pointers and you make 4 of them, well, one of them has a higher point per shot value than the other, even though the 2-point percentage is better than the 3-point percentage. So what they wanted were opportunities to score more points each time they shoot the ball. So what does that mean? That means more 3-pointers, and it means more high percentage shots as close to the rim as you can possibly get, because obviously that's when the percentages are higher. So they don't want any mid-range jump shots unless the shot clock is about to expire. And then they put a huge emphasis on not just points in the paint, but points in the restricted area, because what they noticed, and Luke Murray told me he talked about this a lot with Adama Sanogo. He was like, Adama, look, this is what you're shooting inside the little restricted area right at the rim. And this is what you're shooting in the paint when you back up a couple of feet. And he's like, you can see the huge difference. It's like a 30% difference if you're shooting from 8 feet or shooting from 2.5 or 3 feet. So if you can just get your initial positioning a little bit closer, if you can get your seals a little bit tighter to the rim, your points are going to go off the charts. So those are the types of little changes that they made to maximize their points per shot by taking shots that produce the most points, aka threes, and then the highest efficiency shots closest to the rim.
That's fascinating. I think I want to not veer off, but I want to kind of throw you a curveball here. So when I look at them playing defense as well, and I've talked about this on the show before, it looks like that same analytical mindset is put into play, especially when Klingon's in the game and they don't have to hedge on screens and kind of attack ball screens. Because what you see is, and I'll use the Creighton game where they lost as an example. They were up 11-3 before Donovan had 2 fouls. And when he came out, they started to chase and they allowed Creighton to kind of get hot from 3. Before then, Creighton actually didn't make too many threes and everyone was staying at home. Is that kind of the same philosophy on defense where they try not to help, even though it's innately in every basketball player's mind as they want to try to help on double teams? I could hear Dan Hurley scream through the TV, stay at home. Is that similar to what we're talking about from a defensive standpoint?
You know, I can't speak too much to that because the focus of this article was so much on the offense that I didn't pick their brains as much defensively. But what I will say is, in conversations with some of the coaches on the staff, they really pointed out how much they've emphasized understanding the player-by-player aspects of a scouting report now. So let's say you have a team that shoots pretty well from 3. So in general, you're thinking, okay, I can't let that team shoot 3-pointers. But if you look a little bit deeper, maybe player A is a sharpshooter, but player B really isn't. So it's about understanding when you need to go out on a shooter and when you don't. And so the example that they gave was with Alex Karaban. Not only has Alex Karaban done an excellent job of knowing the shooting tendencies of the 4-man that he's always going to guard most nights, but they said he's one of the players on the team that truly knows the scouting report for all 5 starters plus guys that come off the bench. And he often makes the most intelligent decisions when it comes to closing out or not closing out or how hard he closes out on guys, because he can really process in that split second, is this a guy that I need to be running out and contesting, or is this a guy that I want to be shooting? So I think that plays into it a little bit in terms of what you were talking about.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. One more question before we move on to another topic in the article. I wonder, I'm paraphrasing here. This change was essentially motivated by a desire to win the NCAA tournament, to kind of get a 6-game tournament, and they wanted to necessitate a higher scoring offense. I get the sense that some people around the country would disagree with Dan on that. But do you think this was more about mental self-preservation for Dan? Because you mentioned in the article, I think there was a quote, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's a lot easier when you can go on runs versus kind of mauling other teams and being in a rock fight. Do you think that had something to do with kind of embracing it? It's not probably his persona to go with this analytical approach.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And that was one of the things when I talked to other coaches about, they said, like, Dan doesn't get enough credit for how much of a change he was open to making. Because, I'll use football as an example because I cover college football and I've covered the NFL as well. Those coaches are so rigid and so set in their ways and so scared about their scheme and what they're doing that they don't want to change anything. Now, that's not quite the case in basketball. It's not quite as much paranoia or, they're not quite as neurotic as football coaches. But it's still a system where they got to where they are because of what they've done over the course of their career. And so to suddenly say that you need to change what has worked well for you in getting a premier job, the way that Hurley has a premier job at UConn, that can be hard to take. And some guys don't want to do it. But he really understood that if they want to win the NCAA tournament, they have to have more ways to win basketball games than just grinding out 60-58 ugly, disgusting rock fights where their defense is great, their toughness is great, their rebounding is incredible, their energy is amazing, but they are throwing up brick after brick after brick and just surviving by the skin of their teeth. So as he has tried to make other changes in his life as well, and I know there's been a lot of articles written about how he's tried to take care of his mental health and his panic attacks and things like that. One of them was, if he can find ways to be more comfortable coaching on a nightly basis, that's great. That's an awesome added boost. And if they have the ability to score 90 points or 80 points or 75 points instead of 61 or 62 or 58, then that just widens the margin for error that they have on any given night. So if it is a average or subpar defensive night, it's not the end of the world anymore. And so I think it has made him happier because look, I mean, you've watched all their games this season. How many second halves in the last like 7 minutes have they not even really had to worry about what's going on because the game's already in hand by that point? That's a lot of reduced stress over the course of a season. And so I think it's really helped him in that regard. And it also has solidified that the choices and changes that they have made have been worthwhile.
No, it's a great point, and definitely understand where you're going there. We'll dive into more with UConn's offensive transformation after this. This week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest, just like any and all of our new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The UConn Huskies can only be described as an armada. This top-seeded team is as hardcore as it gets, so it's no wonder they've landed the top overall seed in the NCAA tournament. They're one of the favorites to win it all, despite 4 of the 6 Power 6 conferences champions standing in their way in the East region. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. Say goodbye to busted brackets. Our friends at FanDuel, it lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on the big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit fanduel.com/UConn and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. All right, Michael. The second segment, I want to jump into an old friend of ours who's playing for the New Orleans Pelicans, Jordan Hawkins. How did performances in the article? I think you talked about how they showed him clips of Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, specifically to inspire and envision for his essentially a new role in this motion style offense. Can you share insights into the initial conversations with Jordan and how critical that was in how this offense was transformed?
Yeah, so one of the things Dan and I talked about when I was up in stores was that part of the reason he thinks that New Mexico State game went the way that it did was because Jordan Hawkins was unavailable due to the concussion that he was dealing with at the end of that season. Now, you can look at Jordan's stats and he had a very modest freshman season by all accounts, really. He was only playing about 10 or 12 minutes a game, maybe 15. He was only scoring, I think, 6 or 8 points a game, whatever it was at that point. But he had started to ascend a little bit toward the end of that season. And so what Hurley explained to me was that what they were seeing in practice from him were the traits that they thought made him arguably the best movement shooter in college basketball in the last 10 years. So what they mean by that is not a guy who can pull up off the dribble, but a guy who can run around off screens, a la Ray Allen toward the end of his career with Miami and Boston, a la Richard Hamilton, especially when Hamilton was with the Pistons, but also things that he did at Connecticut as well. But these guys that can move and weave and bob around all these screens and then catch the ball and in a quick instant just launch it and let it go, whether they're on balance, off balance, whether their feet are lined up, whatever. And so I think that helped perpetuate their sort of embrace of this analytical approach because they had someone that they thought could do it at such a high level going into the 2022-23 season. So in that spring, in about April of 2022, it would have been, they had a sit-down talk, Hurley and Hawkins, and Hurley basically explained, look, here's how many three-pointers per game Steph Curry was attempting at Davidson. Here's how many three-pointers Klay Thompson was attempting per game at Washington State. And here's what you attempted last year. You got to get to what they're doing because that's what we want to do analytically. We want lots of threes. We want to use your ability, and we want to feature you in our offense. You on the outside, Adama on the inside. And so that's the change that they ultimately went to. And I still think they would have headed in this direction anyway, toward the three-point shooting, the analytics. And obviously Cam Spencer is a guy who does similar things to Jordan Hawkins, although not quite at that level with the way that he moves and the athleticism. But I think because they had Hawkins and his skill set in particular, it really just accelerated this curve and this acceptance of what they were trying to do. And so he was kind of like the embodiment of that approach to begin with, of Adama at the rim and Jordan Hawkins beyond the three-point line. And those are the two things that are going to get us closer to a national championship than anything else. And ultimately that proved to be the case, along with, of course, Andre Jackson, not trying to downplay what he did whatsoever, but just in terms of the analytic piece, the two guys that were most important were Adama and Jordan Hawkins.
Fair enough. Talk to me about fundamentals and flexibility. I want to ask you in particular about the drills they did with wide receiver gloves. First off, I love wide receiver gloves. I don't know if people have ever worn them. I played 1 year of college football 20 something years ago. Those gloves were kind of just starting to come out, and they're awesome, right? Still own a pair to kind of throw around with the kids. What was the purpose of that from a basketball perspective? I've heard of football drills where they teach cornerbacks not to grab by holding tennis balls and things like that. So explain that to the audience. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, so I remember I was watching practice on the day before they blasted Marquette in Hartford, and they opened up practice with each guy putting on football gloves or wide receiver gloves, and each guy had 2 basketballs. And then I was just kind of like chuckling to myself because they weren't number 1 in the country at that point, but this is a team that is now the number 1 team in the country. They were, the defending national champions. And, certainly there were elements of their practice that were extremely high level and intricate and reflective of what I just talked about and the status that they've obtained. But the beginning of their practice was just so simple and so fundamentally sound. They're just dribbling basketballs 1 at a time, 1 in each hand, 2 at a time, 2 in each hand. And they have these wide receiver gloves on. And it's like, it was to master how they handled the ball, knowing that it was going to stick to them a little bit differently or that it was going to feel different. And so they just wanted to get as much control of the ball as they could, whether you were Tristan Newton or Donovan Clingan and Samson Johnson. It didn't matter. Everybody on the team was doing the exact same stuff. And the point of it was that everybody needs to be fundamentally sound in this offense because everybody touches the ball and everybody passes the ball. So what I mean by that is if you were to go back to use a UConn example, think about like Hashim Thabit and when they would throw the ball inside to him for traditional post-ups. Even though Donovan Clingan is a fantastic center and a potential lottery pick, there's not a lot of pure post-ups for him in this offense. They don't do that very often. Instead, what they do is they take their big guys and they bring them to the top of the three-point line and they use them to screen and move and then slip, or Donovan is a great passer. And so essentially everybody from Tristan Newton to Donovan Clingan needs to be able to handle the ball. They need to be able to dribble. They need to be able to do dribble exchanges. They need to be able to pass. And so it's all about building the same fundamental skills regardless of what position you play. And where does that come from? Well, part of it comes from Hurley's father, Bob Hurley, who was all about fundamentals as a high school coach. And the other part of it comes from the European model that I know we're going to talk about a little bit and how they're embracing things from overseas. Because overseas, they don't do what we have done traditionally in American basketball, which is take the big guy and put him on the block and say from the time you're 12 years old, you're a center and you only touch the ball on the block. In Europe, everybody is taught the same fundamentals. Everybody is taught positionless basketball. And then the guys that grow or the guys that don't have their positions tailored accordingly. And so that was sort of to embody this as well, that everybody needs to have the same skill set because everybody is playing interchangeable positions, regardless of whether you're 6'5" or 7'2".
No, that's beautifully said. And you also, I was going to ask a question about Bob Hurley Sr. So you kind of took that one early, and that's fine because I'd love to get to the Luke Murray stuff and Alex Caravan because those are two gentlemen who I feel like don't get enough credit for all that they contribute to UConn. And we'll do that right after this. Are you watching ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or for free on Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, for me, the Fire Stick was my first intro into streaming, and Fire TV is now your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. For Fire TV offers amazing viewing experience with smart TVs, as well as a Fire TV stick to take anywhere you want. Has millions of movies, TV, and episodes, as well as free and live TV, whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, which we're talking about today. You're going to want to have Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and conference tournaments and NCAA tournaments as well. Fire TV channel lets you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more. Keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports, including March Madness, of course, and the NBA. All right. So let's elaborate on Luke Murray and his unique perspective and integration of global basketball concepts and how that's shaped UConn's offense. I mean, you can go into whatever you want about it. What was specific about global basketball FIBA that was most influential in this? And is it mostly about the 3-point shooting, or can you elaborate more?
Yeah. So when I was talking to the coaching staff, they sort of explained to me how, when Luke was really young in his coaching career, he just kind of became fascinated and obsessed with this idea of studying trends in basketball in different parts of the world, anticipating or trying to anticipate which of those trends or things would then make their way to the United States. And so if they were then coming to the United States, he would have had a little bit of a head start, but also have already begun to think about like how he could implement them with the teams and the players that he was coaching. So as a basketball junkie, he spent less time watching the NBA and more time watching things like the EuroLeague, watching FIBA, watching the NBL. I mean, I talked to a bunch of different people for this article, and I had the countries that people told me that they knew he watched teams from were everywhere from like Australia and New Zealand to Russia to Spain to Italy to all over the map. Like anywhere you can think of, he watches teams. And what he's done for years is essentially make clips of different ideas that he likes, and he categorizes them by different families of plays. And then when the teams that he's working with, if they have a specific problem, and what I mean by problem is, let's say they're trying to find ways to generate more shots from the left wing for their shooting guard. Well, then he can go into his library and see where he has plays from, leagues overseas where movement is the focus, where off-ball screening is the focus, which is now what UConn does much more than ball screens and isolations. And so he can find those concepts and say, okay, look, here's a team in Spain that did this. I think we can adapt this concept to what we want to try and do with Tristan Newton, and here's how. And so he basically has like this, it's like thinking of a Rolodex, but instead of names, they're plays and ideas and concepts. And so he was able to find ways to tie that into UConn's program and also pair it with the analytical approach, because so much of the European and international game is based on 3-point shooting, off-ball movement, off-ball screening, and things like that, that it paired really nicely. And so that's been a huge emphasis for them. And Hurley told me that his study habits have changed accordingly. He's watched much less NBA now, and he focuses much more on FIBA and the Euro leagues and the Euro Cup and also the other good college offenses around the country. But taking stuff from the NBA, which used to be all the rage in college, is now less of his focus because the rules are so different that he almost described it as being two separate games because of how different the officiating and the rules are and things like that.
For sure. Do you get a sense, because you just mentioned Danny here, that the philosophical switch was more innately difficult for Danny and Kamani to embrace, even though they knew something had to change?
Yeah, I can't say how difficult it was, but I know they had to be talked into it at first. So it might be one of those things where once they saw the benefits, the light switch was on for them, and they just went with it. But I remember the quote he gave me was about the analytics, and Luke was really into analytics basically since about 2014 and 15, when he got obsessed with the Golden State Warriors and a team in Spain that's based on the island of Tenerife that basically had the same offensive systems, which were 3-point shots, off-ball screening, free throws, transition layups, and shots around the rim. No mid-range jumpers, no long twos, no pull-up jumpers, none of that stuff. And so he became obsessed with it then, and they use a company called HD Intelligence that tracks like where on the floor their shots are coming from, how many points per shot they're generating, all those different types of things. It's broken down by team, it's broken down by player, and they really use that a lot. And so the way Hurley explained it to me was that, him being from New Jersey and Kamani being from New York, he basically said that when analytics was first explained to them, they were like, what is this? Like, this doesn't make sense to us. There's no analytics on the playground. There's no analytics in the park. You just play basketball. But now that they've embraced it, they said it's completely changed not only the way that they're building their offense and their schemes, but it's helped them identify different player profiles in recruiting to fit the different types of things that they're doing. It's helped them solidify the types of players they want to go after in the transfer portal based on the skill set of the individuals involved. So it really has touched all different areas of the program, from the offensive scheme to the coaching study habits to the way that they're recruiting players to the way they're dividing practice time by siphoning it away from some of the defensive stuff that Hurley was so obsessed with and putting it more into offense and screening and movement and things like that. So it really has changed the whole program top to bottom, and the analytics has been a significant piece of that.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I'd imagine winning a national championship or on the way to it can change hearts and minds. I'm sure that it happened well before then, but when I think I've always joked around that winning titles and just winning in general changes a lot of people's thoughts, and I'm sure there's a lot of older folks, older than me even, that have watched this, and even going back to what we talked about telling people to just relax when they shoot a lot of threes. It's kind of part of the process. To just embrace it and kind of understand there's a method to the madness. I would imagine that, when you have these, what you guys are, or what they were calling game processors, and these high level athletes and recruits, that you need these effective game processors like an Alex Karaban to make this all go right. He was quoted as being called the brain center. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I think it would be hard for you to argue that Alex Karaban is the best basketball player on the team, given what Tristan Newton has done this year. But I think you can argue pretty unequivocally that he's their most important player because of everything that he does on both ends of the floor. And that goes beyond his skill set. And so the point that I made in the article was like, he doesn't lead UConn in scoring, assists, rebounds, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, free throw percentage, but he's the one guy that makes the system tick. And why is that? Well, first of all, he has the positional versatility to play the 4 or the 5 in small ball lineups, as people have seen this season. But more importantly, he's a stretch 4, so that meshes with the European concept and with the 3-point shooting. And also, he's just so smart and makes so many intelligent plays that he makes everybody around him a lot better. And so I was talking to one coach, John Gallagher, the coach at Manhattan, who they played earlier this year, and he said, I would put Karaban in the 5, 6, or 7 best players in the country in terms of what he does for a team. And Shaka Smart called him a winning player who does things that don't show up in a box score. And I know that's a cliche, but there are lots of examples. And so Karaban is the guy who, if a possession's not going well late in the shot clock, he's often the one that makes the timely cut for an easy layup or a floater or something like that. He's the guy who is explaining everything that the coaches are telling them, the high-level schemes that they're going over. He's explaining it to the teammates who are slower learners, because I think that's one thing that's easy to overlook at the college level especially, is that all these guys learn at different rates. And so there's guys that you can be a smart person and still be a slow learner when it comes to basketball strategy, or you can be somebody who's not quite as smart and really does struggle, but you're very talented. And teams have all kinds of those things. And so Karaban really goes out of his way to explain things to people. He's the one directing guys vocally on the floor as they're happening, much more so than a Tristan Newton does, who's more of a quiet and reserved guy. So Karaban is just indispensable because he embodies the analytical approach with the 3-point shooting, the positional versatility of being able to play the 4 and the 5, the high IQ to understand exactly what they're doing and what everybody else is supposed to be doing on the floor, and then enough leadership and accountability to be able to communicate that to people in real time as it's happening during games, that Hurley called him the perfect modern player for what they're trying to do. And he was the first player that they identified in recruiting as being one that could really drive this transformation that we're now talking about. And so I think if UConn were to lose one guy, I think Alex Karaban would be the hardest to replace. If anything happened to him, knock on wood, with injury or the flu or anything like that, I think he could be a lot harder to replace than some of the other guys on the team who may score more or who may rebound more or whatever. And that's because he's just so indispensable with how many different parts of the game his skill set really affects.
Yeah, you can even see it. I think I saw a social media where they were just kind of goofing around in the locker room, and who's leading the charge of there. He was like asking them questions like, this is a great UConn player, and they were playing Hangman, and it was like, and Alex was the one at the board, almost like a professor. It was pretty funny. So I couldn't agree more. I feel like he gets snubbed a lot on a lot of first or second team all Big East, because as you mentioned, he doesn't lead them in any category. But it's for the analytic approach, it's pretty amazing that he doesn't lead them in anything, but he's a 40, 50, 90 guy. So it's kind of amazing that Cam has kind of elevated that level of that 40, 50, 90 category, and Alex is a part of that, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say too is that one of the analytics that you can look at now, and there's a website that I like to use, evanmaya.com, where you can look at the offensive efficiency rating that a team has when a certain player is on the floor. And of all of UConn's players, nobody has a higher offensive efficiency rating than Caravan outside of Clingan. And that's for obvious reasons because of what
Sure.
Donovan does. But because of the guy, in terms of the guys that are shooting the ball a lot, that are handling the ball a lot, nobody is worth more to UConn's offense than Alex Caravan is, despite what Tristan Newton has done, despite what Cam Spencer has brought. And those are both tremendous players. But just the what this is a measure of is how well the offense is humming when Alex Caravan is on the floor. And outside of Donovan Clingan, who again plays far less minutes than Caravan does too, partly because of foul trouble, partly because of the nature of the position, that again reinforces that Caravan is probably the single most impactful guy that they have in terms of making the offense tick, because nobody who touches the ball on a regular basis makes their offense better than Caravan does based on the statistic offensive efficiency ratings.
No, it's a great point. So before we get all of Michael's stats of where you can find his work and thank him for his time, I want to remind everyone that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It's also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Michael, thanks so much for coming on. Can you give everyone an idea of your handle is on here for X at Michael_Cohen13. Where can we find your work?
Yeah, so in addition to X or Twitter, you can look for my work on foxsports.com or the Fox Sports app. We've got all kinds of NCAA tournament coverage that we're excited about. I work really closely with my colleague John Fanta, who I know Big East fans are familiar with. So if you read some of my stuff, you can read some of John's stuff as well. We'd really appreciate it. So yeah, X or Twitter to find some of my articles, but then also foxsports.com, and you can download the Fox Sports app.
John Fanta, Big East legend. I love it. UConn fans love some John Fanta. So that's we'll have to tag him in the post. But this has been another episode of Locked On UConn. For Michael Cohen, I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, wishing you all peace, love, and as always, go Huskies.